Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. I have busy lives, and we're glad that you're here today. So for the last 6 years, 7 years, I was working at a Hispanic-serving community college, as Richard mentioned, and I had made the jump from a graduate university, and prior to that, I had done some undergraduate teaching at a private, at my alma mater, actually, at Concordia University, Irvine. And when I jumped into the community college setting, it was with an enormous amount of excitement about the work that I wanted to do there. And I wasn't very aware of the needs of students there until I actually started teaching there. And I found very often that students were underprepared, they weren't doing well, and I attempted to apply all my graduate work focusing on Carol Dweck's growth mindset. And if we just change their mindsets, I know that we could get these students to be successful. And that wasn't necessarily the case, because I had students falling asleep in class. I had students who were working, 12 hours a day in addition to attending my class. I had students who were working all night and then coming to my class. I had students who didn't have enough to eat. I had students who were couch surfing. And I had an opportunity to be the advisor for Phi Theta Kappa, which, if you're familiar with two-year colleges, you'll know this organization. If you're not, it is an honors organization only for two-year community colleges. And as part of that work, my students had to propose and research a particular topic. So one summer I had them read Evicted by Matt Desmond. And it really illuminated for students the challenges that some of the most marginalized people in our communities have. And so this led to a research project that the students were immersed in, looking at food and housing insecurity for students, because I really wanted them to engage in something that addressed their needs, that addressed the needs of other students on campus as well. And this kind of immersed into this really large project. Maricopa Community College District is the second largest community college district in the United States. And so we had a lot of work to do to address this issue. And as we started working on that and saying, okay, we need a food pantry, but saying maybe a food pantry isn't enough. And we've seen this movement because of the Hope Lab. And hopefully you got a chance to listen to Dr. Sarah Goldrick-Rab this morning. And if you haven't, you should follow some of the work that she does. And that's one of my suggestions that I have towards the end, of looking at, how do you address food and housing insecurity on our college campuses? Obviously, not just on our college campuses, but on our university campuses as well, because this is not just an issue that's relevant for community college students, although we see that it disproportionately affects community college students, but also at the four-year university, for graduate students as well. We've kind of been led to believe that somehow eating top ramen is what most college students do. People are doing that not because they necessarily want to, but because they have to. But the issue is a lot larger than that. It's about really not having enough food to eat. And I'll share some of the narratives that I collected from students as we were doing this project. And, I think for me, what was illuminated for me is that I had students in my own class, even though we had been talking about food and housing insecurity and the resources that we had available, who were so ashamed about being in that situation that I didn't become aware of it until week 13 or 14 in the semester. So even though you think you may know these students, I think there's another layer that's simply saying, well, students will come to us if they need help. I don't think that's enough. And so I think that we can employ some policies at the institutional level in order to address the needs that these students have. Because at the end of the day, if we don't, then students are not going to be successful. And in the long run, that's actually not only going to cost us as taxpayers and community members, it's going to be a long line of generation that is going to affect their children and their children and their children. And so how do we begin to address these needs? Because the majority of students I found who come to college don't come to fail, even though we have a disproportionate number of first-generation college students who don't succeed. Most of them come with the hope, some of them, hope in the unseen, that they will do well, that they will be successful. So that's kind of what I want to touch upon, and then obviously leave some room for questions. So okay, let me move this forward here. All right, so if you don't know, and there are different terms, and I have found that not everybody knows has the correct vocabulary. So when we talk about food and housing insecurity, we're talking about material hardship. So students not having enough food, not enough money for food, not having enough money for housing, not having a secure place to sleep. There are some documentaries out, one of the most recent ones by Soledad O'Brien, actually in conjunction with Sarah Goldrick-Rab, looking at the plight of students living in their cars. And actually one of the students we interviewed that you heard from today, she was living out of her car in the Phoenix area during the summer. Yes, about 111, 115 degree weather, and she was living out of her car for about 30 days. And so because of the work from the Hope Lab, we have been able to uncover that this food and housing insecurity, material hardship that is also referred to as that, is a lot more prevalent than what we had thought. And maybe it's that we didn't even investigate it. We thought it just affected a couple of students. If students were homeless or if students didn't have food, why would they be coming to college? And I think one of the things that I've had to do as an educator, and that I know other educators have had to do as well, is to really examine, well, what does this mean? If we want students to be successful, what is it going to take in order for them to succeed academically? For those of you who have taken Psych 101, or if you remember, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So at the bottom of the period, we have these basic needs, right? Safety, food, water, shelter, along those lines. And what we as educators want for students is to be at the top of the pyramid, to actually engage in self-actualization, to have this self-fulfillment, to reach their greatest potential. Now, Maslow theorizes that, well, you can't really get to that level unless you have met these basic needs. And basic needs, not only in terms of food and shelter, but safety, feeling a sense of belongingness. As we're engaging in these questions about, are there some students on our campuses, as we're having these conversations about racial justice in this country, we're beginning to open up dialogue and to understand that not everybody feels welcomed on college campuses. There's been several conversations, there's been obviously protests, where people are saying, you know, I don't feel welcome in that. And in academia, this is also true. And that's a conversation that we need to have. To what extent do some people feel that they are welcome and others do not feel? And what we know already from the research literature is that not everybody feels welcome. So this sense of belonging that Vince Tinto talks about, that he says there is a correlation between feeling that you belong there and being successful. And so before we even get to the sense of belonging, we can't reach the self-actualization if we don't have these physiological and safety needs met. So if we can meet those needs, and that's why this work becomes important, because if you don't even know what those needs are, how are you going to meet the needs that students actually have? So this is kind of my theoretical framework in order to couch this. So this is some of the work from the Hope Lab in publication they put out, I think it was 2 years ago. And, you know, we've come to understand that some colleges, maybe public colleges, are very affordable. Affordability is relative, because what you can afford depends on what you actually have. You know, if somebody is offering you a car for $30,000 and you don't have $30,000 or access to $30,000, doesn't matter if it's the best car in the world, you're not going to get that car. And so what we find is that the people who are most marginalized in terms of socioeconomic status, so those living in the lowest income quartile, are expending most of the money that they have that is even disposable on schooling. And you'll notice here the difference between the dependent and independent student of how much actually they're paying, the net price, even for community college, which, you know, we're expecting in this new academic year that we're going to see more students entering into the community college as families are making decisions about, you know, is this something that we can really afford if they're not living on campus, they're doing online schooling anyways, what does this really mean? And so we begin to see that, you know, paying for college, even though people say, well, it's very affordable. Affordability is very relative. This is part of some of the work that we did. And for me, it was very important that students engage in this work, because what they were able to find, and this wasn't just a faculty conversation that we had or a dean's conversation that we had. This was a conversation that students were having about, for example, the number of hours. It says my connect. Okay, the number of hours that students were working. So average number of hours worked, 28.8 hours. Now, granted, the majority of our students were part-time as opposed to full-time. And the question that I had to ask is, were they part-time because they felt they had to work so much? We did have a quarter of our students, so 1 out of 4 weren't working at all, but we had a quarter who were working more than 35 hours per week. On top of that, we also asked about, there are work obligations, there are school obligations, but for some students, they also had commitment to family. So whether that's taking care of younger siblings, or taking care of grandparents, or taking care of parents, or they had their own children, we found that 50% of them were spending 12 or more hours per week on familial obligations. I don't know about you, I have 3 school-age children, and I can't ever remember doing as much cooking and cleaning as I do now, because of the current COVID-19 situation. So I'm becoming aware of how much we actually used to eat out, because we're staying at home. We're not going anywhere, and we're not ordering out for that reason. And so this issue of familial obligations, I think, is a question that needs to be asked. And then we ask questions along the lines of that the Hope Lab asked, whether you're worried about whether food will run out before you got money to buy more. Here you see the national numbers and the numbers we collected. To me, the most interesting statistic is the one in purple. I go to the food pantry if I run out of money for food. Now, we had a food pantry in our campus. Nobody really knew about the food pantry. 2% of our students actually did that. And so if students aren't using the resources that are there, then the question I think you have to ask is why? First of all, does everyone know about the resources? How do they know about the resources? And if you're thinking in your mind, well, they get it at orientation, I want you to think about all the information that students get at orientation. How much do they actually remember? I was sharing with the Course Hero team that I have a 9-year-old student. My youngest son is 9 years old, and I have to remind him every morning about tasks that I would think he would know already, because I've been saying them for the last 7 years. Brush your teeth, change your underwear, make sure you comb your hair. And I'm not saying that we need to treat students as children, but I think that we need to remind them of the resources that are there, because if you only say it once at orientation, I don't think that's enough. I think that we have to let students know that hopefully it's not too common on your campus, but to kind of diminish the shame that sometimes students feel in accessing those levels of that level of resources. Here's just some more statistics that we found. 43% didn't feel confident in their ability to pay rent on time. I think if we did that study today, obviously I think we're going to see a dramatic increase in that number. Because this was data before COVID-19. 1 of 4 reported that their life didn't feel stable to them. And this is a question that the one about the $300 speaks to access to social and cultural capital, right? Do you know someone? I mean, I know several people that I could go to, and I needed $300 in an emergency. I could ask them for that. But how many of your students have access to that level of resources that they would feel confident they could do that? I'm going to move because I'm noticing here we're at 419 already. We found a correlation between those who felt confident to pay their rent on time and GPA, because that's the question that some people have been asking, like Katie Broughton and others who have done this work with Sarah, is to what extent is there a relationship between food and housing and security and student success? And some of the data that I didn't get to load on here was that we did a study and actually asked that at our university, at our college, is students who stayed in an online course were 2 times as likely to stay in if they were not suffering for food and housing insecurity. And the students who are more likely to default, for example, on their student loans are those who are suffering from food and housing insecurity. So this, I mean, for a lot of students, this risk sometimes that they take of, hey, I got to believe so much in myself that I'm going to take out these student loans and I'm going to be successful, when we actually see our success rates, like I said, at the community college, and you look at them nationally, you know, is not great. There aren't that many colleges that are over 50%. And so how do we begin to address these issues? And there's more work coming out now looking at graduate students, but I think it's a question that we have to ask as well. And graduate institutions need to begin to ask that question. We see distresses over finances, and obviously now post-COVID, or we're not post-COVID yet. In COVID-19 here and afterwards, I think we're going to see a dramatic increase. I've spoken to a number of students as they are waiting for their unemployment benefits to be decreased dramatically. You know, they're not quite sure what it is they're going to do or where they're going to be living. I want to move to these student narratives because I don't want to run out of time here, and I'm being conscious of time. But as I said to you, we collected narratives from students, and this is one of my students, and the one who had been living out of her car. So I want to play this for you.
I'm going to be graduating next semester. So this is my third semester in Estrella. My major is psychology, and well, I want to share my story to help a lot of students and let them know that it's okay to go through certain situations, and most important thing is to ask for help. I'm from a very small town in Mexico. When I was 16, I wanted to explore, to see what was out there, and I decided to come to United States. I wanted to get an education, and I was living with my mom's sister about a year ago. I had to find another place because I was being molested by her husband. So that's when everything started, all the challenges and some good things too. I met a lot of people, and that's when I realized that sometimes you can't really count on family, but there's good people out there that even though they're not related to you, they're willing to help. I'm a massage therapist. I decided to study a short career so I could have a decent job while attending college. I graduated with a 4.0 GPA, and they told me that if I did that, they were going to have a job for me, but they didn't. So finally, someone gave me the opportunity, and I started working at a spa. But that industry is very unstable. Didn't have enough clients. My hours dropped, and I found myself having a hard time paying rent and bills and food. I had to leave the apartment that I was living in. I started living in my car for about a month, and it was very, very hard for me because I didn't want to tell my parents. They're in Mexico. I didn't want to tell them, I'm in this situation because they expect a lot from me, I started having one meal a day. Well, it wasn't even considered meal because it was like a granola bar or something like, I started showering at work because since I work at a spa, there's showers there. We're not supposed to use them, but I would go early in the morning and do it. But I got caught by the manager, and she talked to me and she was like, you can't really do that. I wanted to tell her situation, but at the same time I was way too embarrassing, so I was like, okay. I went to the dollar store, I went to the restroom, and I took a shower there. It was the most humiliating thing I've ever done. And I was like, this can't last forever. It has to change. But then it started affecting my grades because I couldn't pay attention to the class, thinking about where am I going to park tonight to be safe because I was sleeping in my car. Where am I going to shower? What am I going to eat? Am I going to eat? That was the question. But one day, I got a call from my dad. And he told me that my mom had cancer. And I was like, great. I'm in this situation, and now this. And Of course, I couldn't talk to them about what was happening because I didn't want them to feel bad too, you know. I decided to pick up more hours and, you know, find jobs like taking care of kids or stuff like that. And I would send all the money to them because my mom lost her job. This is not the plan that I wanted. I wanted to pursue the American dream, and it's like I'm living the American nightmare. Currently, things are getting better, but because I asked for help.
I'm going to stop there because of time here. Now, you an update. So yet, she graduated from Arizona University, and she has a job. Unfortunately, her parents were not able to come to the graduation because of the restrictions that the current administration had put on in terms of visas and stuff like that. But she did end up graduating, and she has landed a job, and she's doing well, and she's healthy. But to me, the interesting part of this was a student who was in my classroom. She was in my class. She came to class every day. And afterwards, as I told her, you know, as I asked her, like, you know, she would come to me, why didn't you tell me? And she said, I was too embarrassed. I didn't want anybody to know. I was too ashamed. And as somebody who has actually been through that situation of having to ask for help, it is extremely shameful. So how do we create the type of situation for students so they can actually ask for help? I don't know about you, I have an enormous amount of resources to give my students as much as I would like. I was able to land a small grant, but how can we create the types of policies so we can help our students? So let me move to that, and let me tell you about what I think becomes really important. So in addition to push the when go present in front of the governing board, the students and I did, and that led to a relationship with St. Mary's Food Bank so that they could be providing food. Because actually what I was doing is I was having students from my classes provide food for the other students or for the food pantry, and obviously that becomes on top of all my other responsibilities, probably not a really good and efficient model. So we led to how do we form a relationship with the people who do this for a living. So things like the local food banks. And so that led to those types of projects where we could actually do that. And we had food handlers, and we could provide the types of resources in our food pantries for students. We also asked for a syllabus statement. This became a really powerful tool of could we in our syllabus, because that's the first thing that students, you know, the strongest connection that students make is with faculty, because they see faculty all the time, right? So I know student services can play a role as well, but students aren't required to go to student services. They can if they want to, it's optional. But if you include it in the syllabus statement and let them know about the food pantry, let them know that there's counseling available, let them know that there's other resources. One of the things that I've learned to do is to bring in students who have used those resources so a student can see a live person in front of them and say, okay, here's someone that I can connect with because they're going through my situation as well. And then you form a community. You form a community of support. And that became really important. We didn't have, I have to share with you, at the college that I was at, we didn't have overwhelming support, especially from the counseling division, which you would think that's where the support would come from. So we didn't have 100% buy-in, and I think that's important for you to know, because I think as faculty, as administrators, you have to be bored. You have to understand that if you don't provide these resources for students, the likelihood of them being successful is a lot lower. I mean, it's less than 50%, and that's what we have found, and at least that's what I have found in some of the research. The students will drop out, and they actually end up being in a worse situation, because in terms of if they've taken out loans or they've stopped from participating in the workforce, so now they're behind in terms of the wages that they could have earn if they wouldn't have come to school. So I believe we have a moral obligation to help them. I think institutions can do so if you become critical of it. So how do we engage in this functional resistance, which obviously we're having people do that now, but how do we create the type of solutions that are policy alterable? So one, I argue that we need to have access to information. Where are our students? You know, what are they doing? Who's not succeeding? How is food or housing insecurity a variable in terms of their success? We do a lot in terms of measuring student success. Who doesn't succeed? You know, what is our success rate? I was just looking at some of those numbers this morning at the college that I'm at. But what are the reasons for that success? I think becomes an even more important question. And getting that information to faculty, staff, administrators, and that it's not housed with one person. One of the things that happened to me is that every faculty member who had a student with food and housing insecurity would be sent to me. And I was a faculty member. Okay, that's great, but we need ownership from everyone on campus. How do we engage in culturally relevant, culturally sustaining pedagogy and instruction? Because we could bring in issues of food and housing insecurity into the curriculum to kind of, I believe, in my opinion, to diminish the shame associated. I would argue that who we hire matters. Because if we have faculty who are of the mindset that, you know, it's just the students, and I've sat on higher committees where I have faculty or administrators or people who are interviewing for the job, you know, the students just need to get their act together. They're just not really interested in learning. They're not serious about this. There's some efficiency in the students is what I often hear. So kind of this deficit model. How do we weed those people out so they're not on our campus? And if you have individuals like that on your university or college campus, how do you make them aware that this isn't an issue of students wanting, desire to be successful, some barriers that and I something that faculty who went through the system 20 years ago, they'll say, I did it, so why can't students? The reality it's not 20 years. Look at the work of people like Aldrich Grab and others who have been doing this work, Robert Kelchin. You'll see that the type of financial aid that public institutions provide is not enough in the way that it was 20 years ago. That we have a new registration policy that maybe, you know, throws out 3 to 6 questions, short, that would kind of assess food and housing insecurity. And so those are kind of some of the solutions. You know, how do we begin to address that? Those are deeper level conversations that you have to have. I think you have to begin with access to information. The Hope Lab has put out information for colleges and universities to use, and I'm hoping that it gets disseminated not only for undergraduate students, but for graduate students. Undergraduate students. And I think COVID-19 is going to exacerbate these differences even more. This is the lab report that had come out, Still Hungry and Homeless in College. They're putting out a lot of work. They have a lot of work to share with the Hope Lab, and I would encourage you to read the work that they do. I want to open it up to questions. Here's my contact information, and if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm free to connect with you and in any way that I can help. I've been a consultant for several colleges and PTK groups to help them design a project because they're interested in. It's a very powerful project to engage in. It's for the, what's it called? The Action Research Project. So at this point, I want to open it up to questions. Am I looking at the Q&A, Richard?
Yep, I was just about to pop in and say, folks, if you have any questions for Dr. Hernandez, you can start putting them in the Q&A, and we can address them there. And if you feel the need to kind of share more detail, we're happy to unmute you and allow you to kind of contribute to the conversation if you request.
Okay.
One of the questions that I'm seeing from early on in the presentation is, has your work or related work ever touched on medical needs students have?
Yes, I think those are inextricably linked. Yareli is actually a really good example. Yareli ended up fainting in my class because it turned out that she was pre-diabetic and she didn't know it. I mean, Yareli is a very interesting story, and unfortunately, I think that it's more common than not. She would actually engage in food porn during class, and what that is that we had laptops. We were fortunate enough to have laptops in our class, and she would surf looking for food because she was so hungry. And so instead of looking at the PowerPoints or engaging in the activities that I had in class, and unbeknownst to me the entire time, because she sat towards her screen was facing the back. So when I would walk by, I could tell that, I thought she was working on stuff. It looked like that wasn't. And so she ended up fainting. And then she was in the hospital for a couple of days. We were able to sign her up for, so she could have her medical bills paid for. And then she had a dental emergency. And I was able to negotiate with another faculty member who knew I was doing this work to pay for her dental bills. So I think they're inextricably linked. Now, if you're at the university as a graduate student or undergraduate, a four-year university, you're going to have access. They require you to have access to medical insurance, not dental, but medical insurance. And if you don't know this, if you've never worked at a two-year college, our students don't necessarily have access to medical or dental. And so that becomes, I think, an issue that we need to contend with, is how do we know these students, if they don't have through private insurances, then how can we help them get set up to access the services in our state so that they have access to medical and dental? So absolutely, these things are inextricably linked. And I have students still who don't know that they could have access to medical and dental insurance through the state.
I'm seeing another somewhat similar question from Brendan. It's this sounds great for food insecurity, but how have you dealt with housing issues?
Yeah, the housing issue is a lot more difficult to tackle. Though you have fewer students with housing issues, but a food pantry we can set up. All right, a food pantry we can do that. Now I have to tell you that there are some colleges that they're setting up housing. I mean, community colleges, for the most part, don't usually have housing, or they'll have shared housing with a state institution. And so some colleges like Santa Rosa Junior College, they developed a plan to include housing for their students because Santa Rosa, California is very, very expensive to live in, and the students couldn't afford it. And so some students are doing this now, but the housing issue is difficult. UCLA came up with a unique model in order to do it. Some colleges, what they've actually been doing now is, hey, you can, until we come up with a solution, you can stay in our parking lot, you can use our showers. There's liability issues that colleges are always concerned with. And so that becomes the issue. I know some very creative people. I think we can come up with some very creative solutions, but the housing issue is a problem. I mean, is it something that maybe we could join up for students and maybe try to connect with an organization or connect with a company that would help to sponsor part of the housing, I think could be part of a solution. But really, to a certain extent, as a country, we're in the early part of this conversation, and we're just becoming aware that these are issues. If you're a university or a graduate student, then you can have access to housing. But if you're at a community college that doesn't, then we have to be creative. What we did is we looked at resources in terms of overnight stays or other organizations. Churches became a big supporter in terms of my students and giving them temporary housing until they were able to find something permanent or connect with a family member or connect with other students or just even renting out a room. But I mean, this takes a lot of time, and you need dedicated personnel on your office on your campus in order to spend that time doing that type of work. There are some schools who are joining the health services with the dean of students, with academic affairs, because they recognize this is all linked together. And so I think you're going to see some very creative solutions from people. And I mean, that's the part that I'm excited about, but we still have a lot of work to do.
Wonderful. I want to make sure that we address Daniel's question. He asked during the presentation and asked again, perhaps a quick question, but were military veterans included in your study? Yes,
they were. And we had disaggregated some of that data in terms of those who, because we asked whether they had served in the military or not, were they on the GI Bill, kind of along those lines, because I know that you can receive a housing stipend depending on where you're at, in terms of what GI Bill you chose. We also found a lot of misinformation from all students, including veterans, that, for example, they thought, I can take as many classes as I want and everything will be paid for. That's not true. I have had students or veterans who said, no, I'd rather take the F because it'll be covered by my, they didn't later on in regards to this. So we didn't see the numbers were necessarily higher for veterans, but they also weren't lower. So there wasn't a significant difference between the veterans and the non-veterans.
I want to perhaps kind of combine two questions that I'm seeing here. One is from Angela. Are there programs that will help people or organizations to start an assistance program to serve students' basic needs? So that's the first question. And then just below it, how can we begin to approach highlighting the importance of these factors and challenges to others who may not have buy-in from the administration? So are there programs that can help us to get started, and how do we kind of communicate this out to get buy-in from the institution as a whole?
Yeah, those are really good questions. So I serve on the board. It's actually was started by Sarah Goldrick Rapp, called Believe in Students. And we give out small little grants to faculty for $5,000. It's seed money to help you begin to address. The money is actually granted to faculty. It's not granted to staff, unfortunately, but just faculty on campuses. It does not go to your institution. And that's really important, because as a recipient of it, what I found is all these people wanted a part of those $5,000. I'm like, that's for the students. And it's seed money so that faculty associations or faculty unions can help match it, and then you grow the money from there. Okay, so if you're not a part, and I was in Arizona, which doesn't necessarily support faculty unions, but we had a group of faculty who were willing to contribute to that. So it's seed money to help you grow. It's called the F.A.S.T fund. And there's a period after all the letters, F.A.S.T, faculty and students together. So that's one place that you can go, and I know that it's been increasing over time. Now the second, so that's one place. I also know that there are other organizations, especially because of COVID-19, that are looking to, how can we provide seed money to address the needs of students? There is an enormous amount of need. I think that we need to ask institutions where the CARES Act money went, because I'm finding that there are some institutions that did a really good job of giving that money out. And there are other institutions that kind of held on to the money, and they said, no, we'll distribute it in the fall. Where you had some students graduate who were in real dire straits. I have some students who were parents, single parents, and they received nothing, and now they're being told, oh, I'm sorry, you graduated already, and so we can't give you any. So where's the accountability piece for that is a conversation that I think that we may have on a federal level, hopefully in a couple of months, but that the schools do the right thing and give the money out. How do you get buy-in? I think you have to illuminate the problem. I give these presentations throughout the country, and Sarah has given them, and Claire Katie and other people as well. And people are still shocked. People are still surprised. Now, I've been doing this for about 6 years, and I'm like, okay, this is 6 years old to me, but it's not 6 years old to other people. So I think that you begin to ask the question. I was looking at some data from a college this morning, and 1 out of every 5 students completes a transfer level math course. Okay, and that's high because it used to be 10%. So 20% of the students complete transfer level math courses. And so the question I ask is why? Why is that? I refuse to believe it's because students don't care. I think that's a cop-out. So I think that if you can get, whether it's your department, whether it's your classes alone, you can get the dean of students, or you can get your college and university to administer the Hope Lab survey, then you can get a better sense of what percentage of our students are struggling with food and housing insecurity. If you don't have the data and you have anecdotal evidence with 1 or 2 students, it can be compelling if you have someone like Yareli's story, but not everyone, thank goodness, is Yareli. And so how do you come to understand the issues that are there? I think you have to listen to students. You can do it through focus groups. You can do it as a class project. That's one way that I have psych students who are honor students who do class projects and who go and talk to other students, and then there's a forum for them to present it. I have my students engage in work. Now I teach psychology, so I teach statistics and research methods, and a lot of them have, I I nudge them to engage in projects that have to do with students' experiences on campus. And they find some really interesting things. Like we did a project on advising. The majority of our students hated the advisors. Nobody connected with them. So then that actually led to a presentation to the college president, and they changed the advising model. And I think when you empower students like that, they're like, well, work really matters. I'm going to figure my work really matters. And that's where you get them to see their voice matters in the system. So I think you can begin there, even if it's just your classes, to ask the question. There's 6 questions. If you're collecting data just for your own class, you're not presenting it at a conference or anything like that, then you don't have as rigorous hoops that you have to jump through. But I think asking your division chair, asking your dean, asking the college president, if it's a smaller college, can we do a survey? I think this is really important, because I don't think anyone's going to say, no, I don't think we're going to have to do that on our campus, right? I mean, you have to present in a way that they can't say no, because if they say no, it makes it seem like they're completely out of tune with the students. So I think that's one way that you can do that. You have to collect the data. And these narratives, like this was one of several that we had. I mean, it just really moved the entire room and the governing board. We didn't play the whole thing for the governing board, but it just said to people, people were crying after Yareli's story, and to say, what can we do to help? And then you get that. What can we do to help? And you're like, yes, that's what we need.
I think I can hopefully speak for the rest of the room to say that we were moved as well. And I think it's really remarkable inviting the students into that process. I think that's such a really cool approach and compelling. I want to perhaps combine some questions here again. My good friend Joab Corey, I see asking a question. Other than provide context for available resources and providing a syllabus statement encouraging students to ask for help, what other steps or measures would you take to encourage students to ask for help? How often would you send email reminders? How often would you bring it up in class? And there's a question just above from Cora that asks about pamphlets and handbooks that are resources from the university or college.
I bring it up every week. Every week I start, and especially, when the COVID happened, and I would say to students, I had this check-in, I'm sure as many of you did, hey, how's it going? What are some of the challenges you have? I want to remind you that we do have, I would bring it up every week. I think students would be like, she mentioned again. It takes less than 30 seconds to bring it up on campus and to remind them we do have these resources. I think having gone through the experience myself, and I can talk about the shame and the guilt that you feel and tap into resources to help you in terms of food and housing, because you can relate to students on that level. I think that's one thing, but having students come in, I usually do that at the beginning of the semester. And it's kind of become a badge of honor, shall we say, as opposed to being, it's shameful that you're in that situation. It's, hey, this is where I was at, and I lifted myself out of the situation. By tapping into these resources, because nobody does it alone. I think then it began to change the culture of the institution. But I would do it every single week. I would post it on my in my online classes. I would post it once a week when I had my check-in with them. I would send a summary. This is what we're doing this week, and just as a reminder, if you need assistance with this, and I would let them know there are students who need assistance. I want to let you know, and that's. I was doing that with Yareli, but she still felt ashamed. I think you have to change the culture in your institution in order to do that. But I also think that you need, what I've seen on some campuses is they put it up on some campuses have TVs that have all the information. The dean of students would send out messages. I think you have to inundate students with, here's a resource that's available to you. You cannot leave it to a one-shot deal. I introduced this to you at the beginning of the semester and that's it. And you begin to change slowly the culture of the campus so that it's okay and there's not shame associated with going to the food pantry. I saw one campus do that and they did a really good job. And it wasn't this interrogation where, well, let's make sure you're on the list. Well, let's make sure, if you need I've been in Phoenix. I've been staying in Southern California for a couple of months because I'm moving over here. And the lines for people to get boxes of food have been several miles long. Because now, and you know, because of COVID-19, but I think that one of the things that's going to happen is that there's this familiarity that this is a need that I have. And so I think what's going to happen is you're going to have diminished shame because there's so many people who are in the same boat, unfortunately, that conversation, that I think you're going to have students taking more advantage of those types of resources on campus and in their community as well. But I think that's how you have to do it. We did have pamphlets, by the way. We did have pamphlets that we put up, and we put them all over the campus. And I think you have to have different media for students to access this. I know people get tired of emails because they feel like it's too much, and sometimes it's overwhelming. And you know, every day you get an email, but I think have a reminder from the Dean of Students every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks. You know, I don't think that can hurt. It's going to click for someone and they'll say, oh yeah, we have that resource here. I can do it. I think the most important thing you can do as faculty and as staff on college and university campuses is build a relationship with your students. If you build a relationship, they're more likely to come to you when they have barriers that they relationship. I think it's very difficult to build that trust with students, but it is about relationship building. You know, I had a class of 167 students last semester. You know, difficult with 167 students. I'm gonna build relationship with some of those students. The reality is not all of them, but I'm hoping that that's going to happen somewhere else, but I'm always available for them. I give out my cell phone number. I know not everyone's comfortable with doing that.
Sorry, Dr. Hernandez. I think you froze there at the very end, which is why we may have had a moment of awkward silence. But I really think a really insightful answer, and I love in how you talk about changing the culture at an institution, that for you as a faculty member, it starts in the classroom. It starts with those one-to-one individual relationships. And in my experience, the classroom is always the place where culture starts to change, not even just at an institution, but in a community as well. Folks, if you are asking questions, I'm keeping an eye on the chat, but if you have more questions coming to mind, I encourage you to put them in the Q&A section, and that will help me make sure that I see them. I'm looking at another from Angela. Is childcare part of students' basic needs programs?
Yes. There are some, was it Compton College out in California has a center, which is really like a social services center that addresses childcare. I think they have childcare that they provide themselves. Most campuses won't want to provide. For the students, because 1 out of every 4 students is a parent, and so shouldn't we reserve spaces just for students? And of course, Richard,
a brief moment there that you're able to share your initial thoughts, and so all of the attendees could hear them. So if you could review the beginning of your answer, just so we can make sure everyone
yes.
everyone catches that.
Yes. So I was saying that childcare is a huge issue, and it's actually an even more important issue now because of COVID-19. Because now you have, I have 3 children at home. I actually had to leave them at home and give them the strict guidelines to not hurt each other while I was at the Starbucks doing this. But it's going to become an even more important issue. And just because they're going to be going to school online doesn't mean that they don't need supervision. And trust me, that's been my experience as a parent. And even more difficult when you have younger children to a certain extent, toddlers, you know, right? Because they need constant attention. And so there are some schools that provide childcare. There's some, I mentioned Compton College and the work of Bailey Smith out there. And they've been able to provide, they bring in social services to help students sign up for nutrition assistance or housing assistance, and develop a community of support for students along those lines. But I think that colleges are really going to have to contend with childcare and how you're providing for children and the space that you're offering at the campus. I have some ideas for how you can do that creatively. For example, there's some colleges that have teacher ed programs. And so they need to, could you get childcare for less and have students do internships in terms of early child care? Could you partner up with other organizations so that the students could use work study funds, for example, in order to do that? So I think we need creative solutions to that. Is a care of their children, and now we're contending with, okay, what's going to happen with schools in terms of COVID-19? I just recently found out that if you send your child to school in the schools that open up in person, that they would have to sit at their desk for 6.5 or 7 hours, including eating their lunch. The only time they can get up is go to the bathroom. I don't think that's going to work for the majority of children. It doesn't work for me. I can't sit there for 6.5, 7 hours and do everything at that table. So I think we're going to see these issues exacerbated even more. I think there's going to be a lot more frustration. I think that schools need to address childcare, and they need to address also the welcoming of children on campus. That's a whole separate issue. But I know that my campus within the Maricopa colleges would say children are not welcomed here at all. And so it was like, what, wait? And, I see these pictures of these professors holding babies while they're lecturing, and that may happen at a university or a four-year college, but the community colleges, it's please don't bring your children here. I found the narrative earlier, before Yareli's there, if you notice it started at 5 minutes, was a narrative whose husband had to start traveling because they downgraded her husband's job, and she had this special needs kid. And I happened to find out that she would trade babysitting because her class was at night. So out of the 25 people in their bio class, they would each take a turn babysitting the kid for about an hour. So each of them would miss an hour of lecture, but they traded notes. I mean, it's a creative solution. That's obviously not what we want, but how could you do that in an effective manner? And use the resources that you have at the college to do that. I think we can do a better job than what we're currently doing right now. But childcare is a huge issue, and it's going to become an even bigger issue until we get schools back in person. Not that I'm saying that we should open up schools, and because I don't feel 100% safe. I'm not sending my kids to school in person. But I think we're going to have to come up with some solutions that are better than what we currently have. In terms of addressing the needs of childcare. What alternatives are there? I had a lot of students who were parents who didn't know that you could receive assistance for childcare. And then we had to work with social services to say, okay, you're expecting this person to go to work if they receive the childcare assistance, but if they do that, then they're not going to be able to go to school, in which case we know that the lower education you have, the greater need they're going to have in the long run, and then it's going to affect their children's schooling as well. So working with DES to have them understand what are the current requirements and how do we make it feasible for people to actually get an education. Those are very difficult conversations to have, and I've had them one-on-one with social workers, but I think we need to do it on a much larger scale and use the power of elected officials to do that effectively.
I think we might have 2 minutes left, so perhaps one more question, and thankfully there's a question that was repeated here. So the question is, what are some of the signs that faculty should be looking for among students to identify need or to speak up or check in with them?
Yeah, that's a great question. If students are falling asleep in class, you know, it sounds like, yeah, well, of course they're falling asleep, but I would have students fall asleep and I'd be like, okay, you don't want to be here? You don't care about my class? Is it me? I'm boring you. I'm not funny enough. You know, and I began to start asking, can you tell me what your schedule looks like for the week? What are other obligations that do you have? And I started finding out, you know, we have a big Amazon warehouse out in Phoenix in the area that I was at. And I had all these students working at the Amazon warehouse. And then I came to find out that the Amazon warehouse, even though they start you off at 20 hours, at least at that warehouse, by the end of October, they require you to work 40 hours. And so students were in this position where they're like, no, I can do the Amazon warehouse for 20 hours, but now they're asking me for 40 hours. I can make it. I can make it from November until the middle of December. I can work the 40 hours and go to school and I'll be fine. And the majority of them would fail their classes. So all this time that they spent, you know, in the class and the last 6 weeks, they weren't coming to class because they were too tired. So I think if you see students that are tired, I think if you see, one of the things that I do is I bring in food. Actually bring in food for students. I'll say, hey, I have an extra sandwich. That's actually how it starts off. I usually say, I'm like, oh, I have an extra sandwich. I'm gonna leave it here if anybody wants any. And then I would begin to see some of the same people. And then I could open up that conversation. We had a food pantry on our campus. I had one in my office where I had peanut butter and, you know, just snacks like, you know, that you would get out of a vending machine or fresh food or something along those lines. And when I started seeing the same students, then I could open up that conversation. Hey, how are you doing? Did you know we had this, blah, blah, blah. And all of them will say inevitably, no, I'm fine. I'm fine. I just didn't get to make lunch today. I mean, they would all say that until you build that relationship. So I think if students are falling asleep, if students are coming in late, if students aren't turning in their work, I think instead of being punitive and saying, oh, you don't care about this class, I think you open up the conversation to say, hey, can you tell me what's going on? Is there something going on? And I found that students are very honest. I get faculty who will say to me, what if they lie to you? I think that's a really common question I get from faculty. And what if they lie to you? And I said, some will. I'm willing to have a couple lie to me in order to meet the needs of the students who need it the most. So I will give students the benefit of the doubt. Have some students lie to me? Absolutely. Yes. And they'll make up excuses and they'll say, well, I couldn't do this. And especially because they know I work on these issues and I'm okay with it. And I think that's one of the things that you have to think about as a faculty member and a staff member. Are you okay with that if you know that you're going to get some students down the road that you're going to meet their needs? And to me, that was a lot more important. So if they're falling asleep in class, I think that's a number one thing. If, you know, when they start missing assignments, if they've been doing well on exams and then they all of a sudden stop, you know, or they don't come to class, I think that's a sure sign that something's going on. And this isn't just, hey, it was my 21st party and I wanted to party that. I know it's not that. I have students who told me that, okay, you know what, I turned 21 or I went out drinking with my friends, or, you know, I stayed up too late, or I was helping someone else with their work and this is what happened. And that happens, but you develop that trust relationship. And I think you have to give students the benefit of the doubt. And sometimes they're not going to do the things we want them to do as students. And that's okay. I mean, it's not okay for them to do that, but that happens. But you're going to pick up the students who really do need your help. And that to me is worth the conversation.
Right. Really, really extraordinary, wonderful stuff. Thank you, attendees, for really insightful questions. And of course, Dr. Hernandez, unconventional, but likely one of the most memorable sessions of the conference. For also really important and insightful, important content. So we're deeply appreciative. And we will let everyone run to their next sessions or their next obligations. But thank you for joining us. And thank you again, Dr. Hernandez.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you, Course Hero. Good luck, everyone. Everyone be safe.